All right, so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can put my PowerPoint slide up here. And you guys tell me if you can see it. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it. All right, well, greetings, everyone. In this new age of technology and impersonal personal connection, I guess, something like that. Anyway, I'm glad I'm here, and what we're going to do today, we just went through two holidays the last couple of weeks. Some of you may have recognized Jewish Passover and Christian Easter, which involves Lent, 40 days of basically fasting or doing without. So we're going to talk this morning about this whole Passover thing. And the title of the talk is Passover and Passing Through. And the passing through part of it is a holiday that really has never been declared, and it isn't very well known. So I'm trying to get my, there we go. Can you still see that?
Yep,
Yes.
we can see it full screen now. Thanks.
Okay, great. So let's jump in. First of all, I want to start with this big idea that I almost always start a talk or a teaching session with, and that is the idea of soul making. What is it? And I want to read a quote from Camus. He was not a religious man, but he had a pretty profound idea of why we're in this world. He said, if there is a soul, for him it was a question, but if there is a soul, it is a mistake to believe that it is given to us fully created. It's created here, throughout a whole life. And living is nothing but the long and painful bringing forth. So according to this view, and I'm not saying it is the truth, but I'm suggesting it as a perspective, we don't come into this world with an immortal soul. That's more of a Platonic or a Neoplatonic idea. The Hebrew idea is that the soul comes into this world and becomes immortal through living in this world. So there's not an automatic immortality attached to the soul. It comes through the way we live in this world. And that's why I and others call it soul making. So we are actually, through our lives, through our relationships, through our engagement with this whole lifetime, from birth to death, and all of it's important in between and in the beginning and the end, souls are made. And I'm suggesting this is the idea of the Passover and the story of Israel. So, first of all, the Passover story summarized. Most of you know it, but very quickly, when you read the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament, we read about Abraham and Sarah basically forming the nation of Israel by receiving a call, going into the Promised Land, and the children of Abraham and Sarah become the nation of Israel. But at one point in the Genesis story, this growing nation that will become Israel ends up going to Egypt because there's a famine. So they go down there to get some food. Well, they end up staying for, I don't know, according to the Bible, 400 years, which is a little bit of a stay. During that 400 years out of the Promised Land, they become slaves in Egypt. Now, this is the part most of us are more familiar with. In that state of slavery, out of the Promised Land, given to Abraham and Israel, Moses comes along and is commissioned to deliver them from bondage. Cultural bondage, moral bondage, economic bondage. They're in a state of slavery, inequality. Today we would say social injustice. And in this experience, Moses is commanded by God to bring or facilitate 10 plagues that address 10 socio-cultural deities of Egypt and a system of inequality and injustice. So basically, these plagues are saying, what you're doing in this inequality is not right. So those plagues come along. The last plague is the death of the firstborn child. Now, we're not going to get into the morality and the ethics here. We're just going to look at the story as it is. But in ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh and the pharaonic family were deities. They were gods. So in a sense, this is a way of saying the very last plague or the very last problem you're going to have is that the firstborn child of Pharaoh, who is made in the image of God, is going to die. And the only way you Israelites can avoid this death is to take the blood of the lamb and put it over the doorposts. And then the angel of death will pass over, and that's where we get the term, pass over your house, and you will live. So this gave rise to the Jewish Passover, which is a commemoration of this experience of deliverance from bondage and inequality and being saved from death. Christians call it Easter, the resurrection. Jesus is the Passover lamb. To put yourself in Christ is to be passed over and to live forever. So that's the background. So let's look at more of a metaphorical or some metaphysical ideas behind this. What I want to focus on this morning is we clearly see that Israel avoids the Passover. That is, the angel of death passes over them. But now we read that they have to pass through the desert. Now there's no holiday called the passing through, but it's part of this story. Let's read some of the text here. Immediately after the Passover, Israel is led by the Spirit of God into the desert to be tested. Now this is important language. They had just been passed over, for God's sake. The angel of death had gone by them. Others had died, but they were delivered from it. But then immediately after that, we read that the Spirit of God led them into the desert to be tested. Here's how it reads. Remember how the Lord your God, this is what Moses said, led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years. And remember, Lent for Christians is 40 days. Parallels this. You've been in this wilderness for 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in you, what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He, God, humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that humans do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. This is Deuteronomy. So here, let me summarize. Passed over, the angel of death goes by. Now, passing through. It makes no sense. Why would you keep us from the angel of death to send us out in the desert to be tested? This is soul making. And both experiences in the Hebrew Bible are necessary. In other words, there are moments when we're saved from plagues, and we're saved from death, and we're saved from disease, and we're saved from famine, and miraculous things happen to keep us in a state of security and safety and health. But then there are also experiences where we end up in the desert going through stuff that just absolutely devastates our lives. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because this is the balance that's found in the Hebrew story, and I think in all the world's religions, if we had time, that there are experiences in this life of being passed over, that is delivered, healed, everything goes well. But there are also experiences of passing through the desert where things don't go so well. But as it says here, the purpose of this passing through the desert, through difficulties, through coronavirus and other experiences, is to test you to find out what is in your heart. This is soul making. Now, Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel. So we read the very same story in the life of Jesus. And here's how it goes in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus, immediately after baptism, his own going through the water of the Red Sea, as Israel had, is led by the Spirit of God in the wilderness to be tested, just like Israel was. Here's what we read. Jesus was baptized by John. The Spirit of God descended upon him. He was declared to be God's Son. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted or tested by the devil. After fasting, here's the 40 days and 40 nights. Israel was 40 years. Jesus was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, if you're the Son of God, and then we have the three temptations. Now, these two stories are paralleled intentionally. The New Testament, the New Covenant, is the fulfillment of the Old Covenant. So Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel. Jesus is, again, think about this for a moment. He's baptized. The Spirit of God descends on him. God from heaven says, you are my beloved Son. And then what happens? He's led into the wilderness to be tested. Same as Israel. There's a Passover, a deliverance from death, and God's divine favor is shown. And then immediately after that, it says the Spirit of God led them into the testing experience. So here's the spiritual principle. And if you've kind of zoned out at this point, the spiritual principle is this. There is a necessity of Passover and passing through in the spiritual life. So there are two holy days and two laws of spirituality. First of all, Passover is a spiritual principle, and in this, the New Thought movement is a master. In this spiritual principle, death, disease, and trauma can be avoided by surrendering to God. The New Thought movement, unity, religious science, divine science, call this creating your reality, having the right mind, right consciousness. If we have the right consciousness, we'll be passed over and be delivered from all these horrible things. The New Thought movement is really good at this. However, there's another holy day, passing through. In this experience, troubles, trauma, and disease are part of this earthly classroom, with God as the instructor. The New Thought movement, in my experience, has dropped the ball on this one. The New Thought movement is really good at Passover, seeing that we can be delivered from problems. But Israel had another principle of passing through, and that is we will have to go through some problems. So which is true? According to the Hebrew mythology, they're both true. If you go to India, you say, well, I don't like that mythology. If you go to India, you find the same two principles are true. In India, they have what they call the Trinity or the Trimurti. Brahman, the creator, or Brahma, the creator. Then Vishnu, who shows up as Krishna, is the preserver. He's the one that keeps the Hindus from, having to go through death and disease and troubles and delivers them from problems. But then there's a third deity, and that is Shiva. Shiva is the deity who says, like the devil in Christian mythology, I'm sorry, Vishnu's not always going to get his way of delivering you from problems. I'm going to bring you some problems. Every culture recognizes both of these experiences in the spiritual life. There are times miracles take place. We're delivered. We say, my God, I should have been killed, but for some reason I'm still alive. But there are other experiences in life where we go through troubles in order to test the heart to see what's going on. So I think a full spirituality has the capacity to embrace both of these ideas, and as the Serenity Prayer says, to know when to see the difference between the two experiences. Now, here are some basic ideas from others on the importance of passing through, going through troubles. Scott Peck in The Road Less Traveled says, life is hard, or life is difficult, the very first line in the book. This is passing through. The Buddha, the very first teaching in the Buddha, life is suffering, dukkha, passing through, trouble. Jesus said, in this world you shall have troubles. Keats, the poet, says, call this world the valley of soul-making, where we must experience many forms of suffering in order to make a unique soul. This is passing through. The New Thought movement even tends to neglect this spiritual law, although Ernest Holmes made room for it. And if you're familiar with the New Thought movement, Ernest Holmes is the master teacher of science of mind. This is what Holmes says about the passing through or troubled experiences. He said, God never intended humans to suffer. Suffering may be constructive in that it leads us to a place where we learn. So Holmes is saying, suffering is not the ultimate reality, yet suffering comes to teach us so that we might learn. Holmes also says the only way God can evolve a spontaneous individual, that is to make you a unique soul, is to let him or her alone and allow him or her to awaken. Like Israel in the desert, there's something about the difficult times that reveal not only to others, but to our own selves what our condition of spirituality really is. I see this every time I'm working on this house that I'm remodeling, and things just don't go right. And I find myself getting impatient and swearing out loud and going a little crazy and saying, pretend you're preaching on a Sunday instead of working on a house and act spiritual here. It reveals what's in our hearts. It's not bad or evil. It's just the way life works. Another New Thought teacher, Thomas Troward said, through the process of combining matter with spirit, can we obtain perfect individualization and the human may become a reality instead of remaining only a divine dream. So Troward is saying the same things as Holmes, as Jesus, as Buddha, that in this experience of eternal spirit and temporal matter subject to the laws of physics, only then can an individual be made going through the deserts. There's another Holmes quote. We're going to pass that over. Now, from Passover to passing through the desert. What you find when you go back to the Old Testament is the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch or the Torah, often neglected by people. In classes all the time, I hear people say, oh, I love the New Testament, I love Jesus, but I hate that Old Testament. It's so boring. It has all those laws and rules and regulations. But the Passover experience, or the passing through the desert experience, rather, gave rise to those first 5 books of the Bible. In other words, the Torah, the Jewish Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, came into being as wisdom received through the trials. That's why the word Torah means instruction. It's not just, rules. It's instruction that is given to people that they learn by going through difficulties. The boring books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy reveal what's given to Israel during the passing through soul-making experiences. The book of Exodus gave them wisdom, basically a tabernacle, a place. That is, Israel was taught that human beings must make a place to remember that humans don't live by bread alone. You guys call it the Bremerton Unity Church. The book of Leviticus gives a whole bunch of what we call laws, but the Hebrews saw them as practices to set aside time to remember that humans don't live by humanity alone. That is, we not only need a place, we need practices. We need spiritual practices, Leviticus teaches. And this is what we learn by going through the desert. The book of Numbers, a whole bunch of real-life stories about how impatience and self-obsession and remodeling houses reveal what's in your heart and how you can be changed. The book of Deuteronomy is a covenant. It's a legal contract. We know by looking at other ancient Near Eastern cultures, the format of Deuteronomy is the same contract used in other nations that basically say, I'm going to make a commitment to finding a place, Exodus, to having some practices, Leviticus, and to seeing stories in my life. I'm going to make a commitment to this soul-making endeavor. So, the Torah, the first 5 books, give the wisdom that comes through the desert. This is not unique to Judaism, and I'm not going to go through this list in any detail, but basically you find Buddhism has 4 noble truths, an 8-fold path. This is their Torah. Jainism, not very well known religion, but they have 14 practices called the Gunastanas, which is their Torah. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans had temples of remembrance everywhere, places and rules. This is their Torah. Hinduism has the laws of Manu. They have images. They have temples. Their Torah. All these different cultures learn these practices, the necessity of remembering the invisible realm frequently by going through trials. Christians have a book called the Didache. Most people don't even know about it, but it's basically a book that tells you what places to go to, what practices to be involved in, and stories about how to get through the difficulties. Islam, 5 pillars, and Ramadan. The American founders picked these principles from these various religious cultures and said, as a nation, we need to have days of prayer and fasting, not any particular denomination, but we need to set days aside to remember the gods or to remember God. Alcoholics Anonymous has the 12 steps of action. And many have said because the churches have really lost this practice idea, that Alcoholics Anonymous has kind of stepped in to fill the gap. So the point is, all cultures, which comes from the word cult, which just means to take care of things, have established holy days in active remembrance of the divine. All right, now a lesson from the coronavirus pandemic from all of this. This is just my suggested ideas on lesson. If human culture doesn't remember, and that's again what this whole notion of going through the desert, passing through the desert is about, if we don't take time to find a place, practices, tell stories, make a commitment, Torah, then pandemonium and pandemics take place to remind us to take time to make a place, to set up practices, to tell stories, to do the things we need to stay connected to the invisible realm. The Jewish Tower of Babel is an illustration of this. The Tower of Babel, the people are scattered, enforced social distancing, economic and political collapse. These occur at the Tower of Babel in order for people to remember they shall not live by bread alone, but they have to remember the invisible. Find a place, practices, all the stuff you need to do. Israel, Babylonian captivity, same thing, enforced social distancing. They are taken from their homes and put in a place where they are quarantined in Babylon. Economic and political collapse. They are forced to reassess their whole way of existence. So I'm not suggesting that there's some heavenly superhuman named God who sends plagues and wars. So don't get sidetracked into that, I beg of you, although every ancient culture believes something like that. But I'm suggesting that there is a psycho-spiritual law here. If you forget about the realm of the invisibles, then Pan, the Greek god of chaos, comes along to remind us. Pandemonium, literally means that all hell breaks loose in order to help us see something bigger than we're currently seeing, that humans do not live by bread alone, but by our connection to God or the gods. Here's how James Hillman puts it, and then I'll be done. Hillman says this: the great task of a life-sustaining culture, then, is to keep the invisibles attached, the gods smiling and pleased, to invite them to remain by propitiation and rituals, by singing and dancing, smudging and chanting, by anniversaries and remembrances, by great doctrines such as incarnation, Easter, and by little intuitive gestures such as touching wood or fingering beads, a rabbit foot, a shark's tooth, or by putting a mezuzah, Jewish, on the doorpost, or dice on the dashboard, or by quietly laying a flower on a polished stone. This is from his book, The Soul's Code. Hillman goes on and said, all this has nothing to do with belief, and so it also has nothing to do with superstition. It's merely a matter of not forgetting that the invisible can go away, leaving you with nothing but human relationships to cover your back. As the old Greeks said of their gods, they ask for little, just that they not be forgotten. Myths or stories keep their realm invisibly present. So my point here is that, yes, Passover experiences are great when we're delivered, and we get a lot of that in this nation because there's a lot of prosperity. Yes to it. The New Thought movement, yes to passing over, problems passing over. But let's be reminded in the middle of this so-called pandemic that there are also times in the desert, and they're purposeful, to help us to remember to set up a place, some practices, tell stories, and make a commitment to keep the gods present, because it's so easy to forget we're connected to that invisible realm. All right, I'm done blathering on, so let's open it for questions or silence.
Okay, Colin has shared a question there in the chat box. He says,
Okay, I'm going to get out of my stop share.
Okay.
All right, so I see Colin. Hi, Colin. Passing through is a new your name to understanding what we will have to go through troubles in this life. Why does it take most of us so long to understand this? How many really understand this? Is there any way to speed up our understanding of this early on in our lives or our children's lives? Boy, there's a whole bunch of good questions there, Colin. I wish we had you live so we could talk more.
Hi, Michael. I can go live.
Okay, so give me in your words what your core question there is, or maybe your insight.
I don't have a very good space for being here. We're going to try to get the lights on. And of course, we're still in our pajamas.
I can see you.
The term you used, passing through, we know about Passover. There we are. We know about Passover, but the passing through was a new name to something that we have discussed before in other classes, and we know of the troubles that we have in our life.
Yes.
But we have to go fight that fight. We have to go get out our lances and go fight the good fight like Don Quixote.
Yep.
Why do we have to reinvent the wheel and go through that fight? Why can't we learn these lessons from you? Will it someday be possible?
Because I haven't learned them yet. That's why I say I'm remodeling this house right now, and the true nature of my heart and soul is revealed in those moments when things don't go the way I want them to. You see? Yeah. So it's not a punishment. It's more you still got some work to do, Michael. I don't know how to answer your question except to say that, like children, each child has to go through whatever they go through until they either get it or don't. We either get it or don't.
We either get it or don't.
Yeah, and it's just, to me, it's the way it works. So I think we simultaneously need to sort of lighten up a little bit on ourselves, because some of us can be pretty relentless in self-condemnation. But on the other hand, let's not take it too lightly either.
Can I add a comment?
You may. Hi, Barbara.
Hey, how you doing? As you were talking about the desert, and just kind of an analogy or thought came to me, having grown up in Arizona, and I was thinking the desert can look bleak and barren and like there's nothing there. Kind of ties into what you were saying.
Yeah.
But once the rain falls, which could be the learning of the lesson, the things that are lying dormant under that desert just erupt in brilliance.
Nice analogy.
That is.
Yeah, the seeds are in us. It just takes time for them to blossom.
Yeah.
And again, the basic idea here in all these cultures is to take time and make a place and practices just to remember the gods. It's not like you have to get it all. It's just take time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a big zapping us a little bit with a ray gun. Hey, you pay attention.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I see somebody else here. Let's open this. Debbie Clay, to everyone. Jesus, you will have troubles, yes, and our spiritual journey is to learn from the experiences and grow spiritually. The pandemic may be a lesson to us not only to rely on earthly measures alone. Exactly. That's just another way of saying it. You know, on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, somebody wrote, God sent this pandemic to teach us lessons. Another person wrote back, my God does not send pandemics to teach lessons. Which one do you suppose was right? Anybody there? I suggest they're both right. One person needs to learn lessons from their God. Another person needs to learn that their God doesn't teach lessons. Both. There we go, Cindy. Thank you.